Welcome to the Deep Dive. You know, the show where we like to get to the bottom of things.
Yeah.
The stuff you want to understand, but without, all the fluff and the filler. And
Noise.
noise, yeah, exactly.
Right to the core.
We really get to the core, and today we're going to be talking about how judges make decisions.
That's right.
So this is something that I think everybody's interested in.
Absolutely.
You always hear about these huge Supreme Court cases or even local cases, and everybody kind of wonders, like, well, what's really going on in there? Like, are they just looking at the law? Or
Right. Is it just a formula?
is it a formula? Yeah.
Or something more?
Or is there something else going on?
Right.
And we've got a really great article to kind of guide us on this deep dive.
Yeah, this is going to be fun.
It is. So this is How Judges Judge, Theories on Judicial Decision-Making by Timothy J. Capurso.
Okay.
And it's from the University of Baltimore Law Forum.
Okay.
Way back in 1998.
Wow.
But a lot of these theories, they endure. And I think it'll be really fascinating to kind of dig into those theories and figure out, what they say about how judges actually make these decisions.
Absolutely. I think people are going to be really surprised at the complexity of it because I think, the image that we have in our heads.
The robe.
Right, exactly. It's just this sort of.
The gaver.
Yeah, just, bang the gavel, apply the law.
Yeah.
But it's so much more intricate than that. And that's really what Capurso gets at right from the beginning.
Yeah.
It's like, this is not a simple thing.
Right.
There are a lot of different forces at play here.
Okay, so let's get into these theories. And the first one that we're going to discuss is American legal realism.
Okay.
Which sounds kind of straightforward, right?
Right, it's realism.
Like it's
real.
But it's a specific school of thought.
Absolutely. It's a movement.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, what is American legal realism?
So American legal realism at its core says that judges decide cases based on what they feel is right for the situation. It's not just about looking at a law and saying, well, this is what the law says, so this is how I have to decide.
Right.
They're actually taking into account their own personal biases, their policy preferences, what they think is good for society, things like that, and broader social forces at play. So they're taking in a lot of information.
So it's less about, what's written down in the law and more about like the human being who is interpreting it.
The human element of judging is central to legal realism.
Okay, so very interesting. And the article mentions some really prominent figures who were part of this movement.
Oh, yeah, some big names.
Yeah, so who are some of the key thinkers that we should know about in legal realism?
So we're talking about people like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Joseph Bingham, Jerome Frank, Eugene Ehrlich, Carl Llewellyn.
Got it.
These are all people who, in their own way, emphasize the limitations of just relying on precedent.
Okay.
So precedent is basically just looking at how courts have decided similar cases in the past.
Right.
And they're saying that's not enough.
Got it.
And just looking at the strict language of the law, the statutes, also not enough to understand how judges are actually deciding these cases.
Okay. And Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., of course, very famous Supreme Court justice. I think most people have heard that quote.
The life of the law has not been logic. It has been experience.
Yeah, so right there, he's kind of saying, like, it's more than just, what the law says. It's about what the judges experienced in their life.
Yeah, all of that feeds into it.
Okay, so instead of just, taking a new case and being like, okay, well, this is, the category it fits into, and this is what the law says about that category, the realists are saying.
Right.
It's more than that.
There's something more there.
Yeah, so how did they view these tools that judges use, these legal tools like precedent and statutes?
So they were very skeptical that precedent and the language of statutes could really fully determine the outcome of a case. And this is where the famous idea of the judicial hunch comes in.
Okay, the judicial hunch.
The judicial hunch, yeah.
So that sounds like almost intuition.
Yeah.
Like,
like a gut feeling.
Gut feeling, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell me about that.
So this idea is most closely associated with Jerome Frank, one of the legal realists. And he said that the judge's hunch, their initial feeling about a case, like who should win or what the outcome should be, actually comes before and guides their legal reasoning.
So they're kind of like deciding first and then justifying later?
They're deciding first and then they're looking for the legal reasons to support that decision.
Wow. Okay, so what influences that hunch then if it's not the law?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
So according to the realists, it's all these things we've been talking about. It's the judges' individual experiences, their biases, their psychology.
So like their background.
Their upbringing, their education, their political leanings, maybe.
Right.
All these things can subconsciously feed into how they view a particular case.
Okay.
Even things as simple as, how much sleep they got that night or, what they had for breakfast. Jerome Frank actually compared it to how a jury reacts to witnesses.
Okay.
He's saying that there are all these subtle cues that can sway a judge's initial emotional response.
Interesting.
And then that response guides how they look for the legal justification.
Okay, so that really flips it on its head.
It does.
Because I think, most people, when they think of a judge, they think of like a very
impartial,
by the book kind of
robot. Yeah.
Just applying the formula.
Yeah, and the realists are saying it's way more complicated than that.
It's way more human than that.
Okay, so then the article goes on to talk about, even influences that go beyond just that initial hunch.
Right.
And there's a section called Influences Beyond Legal Doctrine. So what kind of things are we talking about here?
So this is taking it even a step further, right?
Yeah. It's not just about the hunch. It's about everything that makes up that judge as a person.
Right.
So people like Theodore Schroeder, another legal scholar, he argued that a judge's entire life history, their personal impulses, their temperament, their intellectual bias, all of that is going to shape how they understand the law and how they apply it.
So you can't really separate the person from the role.
Exactly. You can't just assume that they put on the robe and suddenly they become this objective being.
Right. Okay, so it's really fascinating. And then we get into, okay, well, what about these written opinions?
Right.
The judges put out.
The legal reasoning.
Yeah, the legal reasoning. So how does that fit in with this whole idea of legal realism?
Right, because on the surface, it seems like, okay, well, that's where they lay out
all the logic,
all the precedent, all the, statutes they're relying on.
Right.
But the realists had a different interpretation of that.
Okay.
So they said that the written opinion is often more of a rationalization after the fact.
Okay, so like a justification.
A justification for a decision that's already been made.
So they're deciding, and then they're kind of, figuring out.
Finding the reasons.
Finding the reasons to support it.
Right, and they're very skeptical that the precedent and the statutes are actually dictating the outcome.
Got it.
They're saying it's the judge's interpretation of those things that's really driving the decision.
Okay, so then the article moves into, looking at what judges themselves say about this.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting because, we've been talking about these theories.
Right. These abstract ideas.
Yeah, but then, we get some real-world insights into how judges think about this.
Right. So we can actually hear from judges themselves what they say about their own decision-making process.
Yeah, so the article talks about interviews with judges, and it calls them Judge A and Judge B.
Right, to keep their anonymity.
Right. Yeah, so what did Judge A say?
So Judge A was very much, a believer in applying the law consistently.
Yeah.
But they acknowledged that their own life experiences and their prior experience as a lawyer, all that inevitably plays a role.
Okay.
They also said that they take into account things like the consequences of their ruling.
Okay.
And even, how well the lawyers presented their arguments.
Okay.
So it's not just a cold, hard look at the law.
Right.
There are other factors at play.
Okay, so what about Judge B?
Judge B similarly emphasized the importance of following precedent.
Okay.
Looking at those past cases and really focusing on the facts of the case at hand.
Got it.
But they admitted that sometimes their own personal biases could creep in.
Interesting.
So they gave the example of having a bias against drunk drivers.
Okay.
But they said, even though, that might be my initial inclination, I ultimately try to adhere to the law.
Okay.
They also mentioned things like how much publicity a case was getting.
Wow, okay.
Or whether their decision might be reviewed by a higher court.
So they're thinking about the bigger picture.
Yeah, they're not just in a vacuum making these decisions.
Right. So both of these judges are saying, like, we try to be objective.
Right.
But it's not as simple as that.
Right. There are all these other things that are influencing their thinking.
Yeah. And I think that's really valuable to hear, from the judges themselves.
Absolutely.
Now, the article then has a section called Taking Aim at the Realist View.
Oh, okay.
So is this like, pushing back on legal realism?
It is. It's saying that, the realists brought up some really important points about the human element in judging.
Right.
But maybe they went a little too far in suggesting that law is completely irrelevant and judges are just deciding based on whim.
Right.
So this section is saying that if that were true, if judges were just doing whatever they felt like, the legal system would be chaos.
Right. It would be totally unpredictable.
Yeah, there would be no consistency, no coherence.
No faith in the system.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are the arguments then that support, the importance of having legal rules?
So they're saying that legal rules and precedent, even though they're open to interpretation, still provide a framework, a structure for decision-making. They provide boundaries, they offer guidance, and the fact that judges have to write these opinions, explaining their reasoning, that forces them to ground their decisions in law, which creates a certain level of accountability. Because then people can scrutinize those opinions and say, hey,
that doesn't make sense.
This doesn't follow, or you've ignored this precedent, or whatever it might be.
Right. So it's not like, they're completely free to just do whatever they want.
Exactly.
There's some constraint there.
There are constraints.
Okay, so it's kind of like this balancing act then.
It is.
Between, what the law says and the human being who's interpreting it.
Absolutely. It's that tension between the objective and the subjective.
Okay, so to kind of wrap this all up, we've talked about the realist perspective, the different influences that judges face, the formalist and the realist view on those written opinions. We've heard from judges themselves, and then we've heard some pushback on realism.
All right.
So what are the main kind of tensions that we see here when we're trying to understand how judges decide cases?
Well, I think the main tension that runs through all of this is the tension between, legal rules and the human element in judging. So are decisions really driven by objective legal principles, or are they more fundamentally shaped by the subjective experiences and biases of the judges themselves? And I think the truth probably lies somewhere in between.
It's a spectrum.
It's a spectrum. It's a complex interplay of all these different factors.
And I think, what's so fascinating about this article is it really does give us a much deeper and more nuanced understanding how judges make decisions than just that simple picture. Of, they put on a robe.
Bang the gavel.
They look at the law, and that's it.
It's not that simple.
And I think, for our listeners, this is so important because, we see these court cases.
All the time.
All the time in the news, in our own lives maybe. And it's helpful to kind of have these different lenses to view them through.
Absolutely. It helps you understand the complexity of what's really going on.
And maybe be a little more critical of, just accepting, a headline.
Exactly.
It's like the whole story.
There's always more to the story.
So maybe a final thought for our listeners to kind of chew on is, when you see a legal judgment in the news or, even if you're involved in a case yourself, how might this new understanding of judicial decision-making change how you view that judgment? Are there different angles that you might consider now? Knowing that it's not just about, this is what the law says.
It's not black and white.
It's not black and white.
It's all these shades of gray.
There's the human element in there.
Absolutely.
And that's really important to keep in mind.
It is.
Well, this has been fascinating.
It's a great discussion.
I really appreciate you joining me for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And for all of our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.